working for a common cause, and that common cause is share with the world what little we know and also learn from others' practices so that we.
Speaker for the day, Dr. Swarup Mukherjee, Associate Professor, NTU Singapore. Dr. Mukherjee is currently a tenured Associate Professor with the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He's a trained physician with specialization in the area of sports medicine. He's also an International Sports Medicine Federation certified team physician and World Health Organization certified trainer in disability prevention and rehabilitation. He's a fellow of the European College of Sports Science and is the first scholar from Singapore and third in Asia to have been bestowed this fellowship. Dr. Swarup joined the Physical Education Sports Science Academic Group of the National Institute of Education Singapore in November 2007 and teaches courses on fundamental and applied sports injuries, injury prevention and safety in physical education and youth sport, growth and motor development and physiology of exercise. His additional research interest is fundamental movement skills, physical activity and health in youth. Dr. Mukherjee is currently a tenured professor he is, during his years of practice as sports physician, Dr. Mukherjee was involved in training and medical aspects of national and international sportspersons across multiple sports. With his growing interest in functional aspects of human performance, he went on to pursue a doctoral degree in exercise physiology from the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. In addition, he also has an honors degree in physical education. Dr. Swarup joined the Physical Education and Sports Science Academic of National Institute in November 2007. And in addition, his additional research interest areas, fundamental movement skills, physical activity and health. He has received multiple research grants amounting to over 1.1 million Singapore dollars, authored to 2 books, 4 book chapters, 16 technical reports, and numerous research papers in top international peer-reviewed journals. He serves as an invited reviewer of over 15 top-tier international exercise science and sports medicine journals, associate editor of an international sports medicine journal, and is the editor-in-chief of the journal's Advances in Skeletal Muscle Function Assessment. In his leisure time, he loves to exercise, play golf, tennis, and travel to mountains. On behalf of the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, Government of India, Khelo India, LNCPE, a warm welcome to our most distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Swarup Mukherjee. I also like to welcome Professor Kluka, whose presence brings charm to this session and function. I also welcome our distinguished principal, Dr. Kishore sir, and also invited guests and my dear friends. A warm welcome to one and all to this session of prevention of sport injuries. Dr. Swarup Mukherjee, for your session, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Usha Nair. It's an absolute privilege to be a part of this monumental initiative by the LNCPE under the Sports Authority of India and the Ministry of Youth Affairs. I think this program sets the benchmark in terms of using technology and as well as long drawn initiatives to develop a platform of knowledge sharing from people across the world that will benefit the PE teachers and coaches in India and also beyond the geographical borders. So I'm absolutely humbled to be a part of this program. Before I start the topic, being from Singapore, I want to give a quick snapshot of the country and my institute so that people across faraway lands can also understand and get to know. So Singapore is at the tip of Southeast Asia. It's that little red dot that the way it's represented. We call Singapore a fine city because we have fines for everything that you're not supposed to do. It's a land-strapped city, so we don't have landscapes, but we have dazzling cityscapes that mesmerizes the visitors in every possible way. My university, the Nanyang Technological University, is located at the west end of the country, which is about like 15 minutes drive from Malaysia. It's a sprawling campus that spans across 200 hectares or 490 acres. and it has been labeled as the 15 most beautiful university campuses in the world. You see that yellow arrow, that is my institute where I work, the National Institute of Education. My university is currently placed at number 11 in the global world ranking university, and it's world number 1 in the list of best young universities. Home to 33,000 students and 8,500 staff. The flagship programs include engineering, medicine, science, business, humanities, arts, social sciences, and of course education. This is where I work, National Institute of Education, and the satellite picture you see with the yellow outline drawn is my department, the Department of Physical Education and Sports Science. Now, National Institute of Education is also world renowned and is among the world's top 10 teacher training institutes, and so is my department, with absolutely state-of-the-art indoor and outdoor facilities. We are among the world's highly rated program in physical education. Our 2 undergraduate programs include physical education and sports science and management honors degree program. In addition, we also offer master's, PhD, and doctorate in education programs. So with that brief snapshot of Singapore, my university and my department, I want to bring everybody's attention to the focus of today's talk, injury prevention and safety in physical education and youth sport. Now, the significance of this topic lies in the fact that injuries are the leading cause of morbidity and mortality in children and young adults. Data show that more than 40% of injuries that children sustain comes as an outcome of sports and physical activity participation. Data from the United States shows that every 60 minutes, 37 cases of youth sports injuries are reported to emergency departments. And along with this also comes huge economic implications, wherein tens of billions of dollars are spent every year to deal with the magnitude of problem that comes as a result of youth sports injuries. Now, what is ironical that despite this massive cost, we still struggle to understand the injury process and change this outcome. So it is absolutely critical to build a culture of safety and injury prevention in physical education, sport, recreation and physical activity programming, and a widespread agreement is required to believe that injuries are predictable and they're preventable. So I look forward to this program, creating that platform for the widespread outreach of relevant information that can help develop awareness, knowledge, and skills in PE teachers and community coaches to enhance safety and minimize the risk of injuries in sport. So my sequence of presentation will go through setting the context, a brief discussion of the existing evidence, understanding the growing athlete in terms of the peculiarities, quickly discussing some of the risk factors that the children and adolescents are exposed to and the nature and characteristics of those risk factors, and a quick discussion of common sports injuries in PE and youth before we home on to the thrust or the crux of the topic, which is how preventing injuries in PE and youth sport, and I'll try and summarize everything in the conclusion segment. So this information is known clearly to all of us. We are all aware of the fact that physical education and sport are the 2 critical vehicles that provide children with the opportunity to be physically active, and this brings about multiple benefits in the long term. But however, along with those benefits, there comes an element of risk. When the human body is loaded to the stress of physical activity, there is always a risk of injuries, and children are no different. But in children, because of them being in their formative years of life, they have multiple repercussions in the event of an injury. If a child gets injured, he might be losing or missing classroom lessons in the schools, or maybe exams may be missed. So there is an educational implication. There might be a need to visit a doctor, take an x-ray, do some medicines. So there's a financial implication. The child has to go through pain, discomfort, and movement limitations, representing physical and musculoskeletal limitations. When a body is injured, the mind is always affected. So the child also has to cope with psychological implications of the physical injury. And a part of this collateral damage also happens to the peers and parents. I remember when I used to come back when I was a child with my bruised elbow and braced knee. First thing my mother said, no football from tomorrow. And the same thing also happens. So this is an example in real world how parents gets affected when they witness a physical damage as an outcome of sports participation. Now, fortunately, most of the injuries that children suffer from are of minor nature, and that leads to short-term implications. 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, I know the child is completely recovered and back to his normal life. But unfortunately, sometimes the damage is long-term. For an example, like a bone injury or a joint injury, this keeps the child out of physical activity for a long period of time. And unfortunate cases, sometimes it can be permanent, as we see in severe head injuries and spinal injuries. But as a collective negative outcome, what has been agreed in the literature, that injury reduces motivation of the child to participate in PE and sport. It prompts the child to pursue more sedentary activities, and in the long run, it has adverse effects on health and quality of life. The study from Abernethy and colleagues inform us that about 20% of injuries in children and youth happen because of participation in physical education, 62% as an outcome of organized sports participation, and the remaining because of casual, informal, and unorganized play-related activities. But what's critical to understand that 1/4 or 25% of injuries reported out of PE or sport tend to be of serious nature, essentially in the form of bony injuries, joint injuries, complete ligament tears, and head injuries, leading to long-term consequences in one way or another. While physical education is a global phenomenon, every institute, every country understands the value of this, but the unfortunate part of this entire context is that minimum research has been done in terms of the risk that physical education poses. If we look at the literature for the last 40 years, not more than 15 or 18 published papers can be found that report injuries in physical education. A study from Utah State in USA, it reported that 23% of all school-related injuries was an outcome of participation in physical education. Studies from Slovenia found that 1/3 of the students they had at least one injury per year during participating in PE. Study from Scandinavia in 1981 found that about 3 to 11% of pupils were injured in PE, that got swollen up about 15 years later to 22%. By far the most comprehensive body of evidence that we have today is an outcome of publication by Nelson and colleagues in the journal Pediatrics in 2009. Now, this was a retrospective study involving over 400,000 students, and based on their hospital-based data, this study found that over a period of 10 years, there was 150% increase in the injury incidence, which was about 24,000 in 1997, and it increased to a significant 62,000 in 2007. And between the last 4 years, which is 2004 to 2007, there was a 200% increase in injuries during physical education. And the most common activities, running, basketball, and football, followed by volleyball and soccer, that were responsible for these injuries during physical education. Studies have also reported that in physical education, the 10 to 14-year-old age group is at the highest risk. In terms of bone injuries, girls and boys have different age windows where the risk is at its peak. In terms of head injuries, the early primary school years of the age of 6 to 10 seems to be at a higher risk. So those teachers and those coaches dealing with this particular age group athletes or pupils, they should be aware of this information and exercise extra planning and caution to safeguard the possibility of these injuries. Coming to the youth sport, now you, me, we have all played sport when we were young kids, and for us the objective was just one, that was to have fun. So that philosophy, apparently, while it has not changed, and enjoyment and making friends remains to be the key drivers of motivating young children to participate in sport, along with a few parallel benefits into health, character, and growth. What we see in today's scenario, that a huge proportion of youth is migrating into the competitive side of the sport. And what's ironical is when the competitive element gets introduced, the balance of fun and friend shifts. It becomes hard, rigorous training, which is regimented. Some reports say that youth athletes train up to 25 hours a week, follow a strict competition calendar, with an inevitable outcome of higher risk of injuries. Some exceptionally talented children, they also participate in more than one sport and play for more than one team. Now this leads to significant stresses on their structurally and functionally immature bodies. An inevitable consequence of this kind of an involvement is sports injuries. And more the frequency of participation, more is the rate and the severity of injury. We also have seen a stark change in the global platform of youth sports participation. Now we have dedicated world level events like the Youth Olympic Games, where the young and talented can display their physical prowess and talent. And this has led to a huge stimulus for increased sports participation, both at the competitive level as well as the recreational level. Now, along with the display of talent, what also drives these young talents towards competitive sports is the lure of rewards in the form of fame, in the form of assurance of university scholarships, in the form of endorsements as far as commercial products are concerned. So there is a lot at stake that is driving more and more youth to consider training hard and participate in competitive sport. As a consequence, the numbers or the incidence rate of youth sports participation has actually gone up significantly, and young bodies are training hard, they are training rigorously, and an outcome in the form of high injury risk and high injury incidence is becoming increasingly obvious. And currently the condition of youth sport injury is being labeled as an epidemic and a public health priority. Let's look at this video to see or emphasize on the point I just made.
Every day, over 3,000 children sustain a sports injury severe enough to go to the emergency room. And the greatest number of injuries are in kids just 13, 14, and 15 years old. To better understand what's happening here, Safe Kids Worldwide conducted a survey of parents, coaches, and young athletes to explore how the culture of sports may be what's keeping kids out of the game. Here to tell us more is Kate Carr, President and CEO of Safe Kids. Kate, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
These are really scary numbers, these numbers of injuries in kids so young, and it seems to be on the rise.
Well, when you look at the total number of injuries, it's about 1.24 million in 2013. That's emergency room visits alone. And if you think about the cost of that to families, that's close to $1 billion in healthcare costs. So are we looking at a greater increase? We're seeing a large number of kids, and no matter what the number is, it's still way too many kids.
Way too high, absolutely. So what's the role that parents are playing here? I mean, they should be protecting their kids, but are they sometimes making this worse?
Well, parents told us that they felt that coaches had the training that they needed, not only in the sport, but in injury prevention. Yet coaches told us more than 50% of them wanted more training in injury prevention.
So they don't have the training necessary for the most part.
Well, there are specific areas of training. So you can have concussion training, AED, CPR, but overall injury prevention, that training doesn't exist now. And we'd like to see that developed and happening.
And as the pressure to perform intensifies, are coaches pushing the kids harder?
Well, coaches could be pushing the kids, but we also found that parents were pushing coaches to play kids, even when kids were injured.
And what were kids telling you? I found it so interesting to hear what kids playing injured would say about it.
Well, 42% of the kids that we interviewed said that they had played injured at some point in time. But even more alarming was 1 of every 4 kids told us that it was okay for them to have a hard hit, a late foul, something that you could call dirty play.
Absolutely.
Something that just didn't belong in the game. And a lot of them were getting injured. 33% of them were getting injured as a result of dirty play.
So how can all groups involved, the children, the parents, and the coaches, how can they stop this from happening? What can we do?
Well, that's a great way to think about it, because we're all involved in it. And we all have a role to play, and we're advocating that at the start of the season, that parents, coaches, and kids get together and set the ground rules. Say that we're going to teach kids to speak up when they're injured so they don't hide an injury, that we're going to work to prevent injury by educating kids and coaches in a better fashion, and that we'll put an end to those late hits, those dirty plays that just don't belong in the
Every day, over 3,000.
Okay, so I hope the video and the audio was clear to everyone. So continuing from the message in that video, it is important for all of us to understand that injury prevention, we are all a part of it. Not just the medical doctor and the physiotherapist, but the physical education teachers, trainers, coaches, even the athlete themselves. We are all stakeholders in this process of injury prevention. Now, what's interesting that when I speak with physical education teachers working in the schools and also youth coaches, like 9 out of 10 times when you ask them the question that who should be responsible for injury prevention, so 9 out of 10 times their answer is that the child or the athlete should himself or herself be responsible. Now, how far is that true? If we look at the evidence and in terms of the responsibility hierarchy of injury prevention, we see clearly that the child assumes the lowest position. That means the child himself or herself should be least responsible for safeguarding against injuries or to prevent injuries. But what is also important for a PE teacher and coach to understand that they are positioned at a very critical juncture. So between the child and the parent and the school and the government. So they are almost at the most that somebody has an influence on the children in their formative years. Again, evidence is quite suggestive that it is the physical education teacher who has the maximum influence on child in terms of adopting best practices and safe practices in play and sport. So again, here comes the value of physical education teacher in influencing the child to be safe in the long run. So with that context, let's quickly understand how peculiar is the growing child. So one of the most important characteristics of a growing body is the fact that the child is still gaining in height. And this height gain is essentially because of increase in the length of the bones. And this increase in length of the bones happen because the growth plates have not yet fused. So these growth plates are soft cartilages, which is important for the child's growth. At the same time, these growth plates are also the weak links in the bone, and therefore, simply speaking, the skeleton of a growing child is immature. It is not yet as strong as you can see in adults, and hence the bones in children are not really capable of dealing with or absorbing excessive amount of shock if it is imposed to them. Even in terms of skeletal muscles, now we all know that muscles are important for generating force as well as absorbing force, and children have muscular immaturity. That means structurally the muscle mass is less, and functionally it is not capable of generating high amount of forces. In terms of the cardiorespiratory capacity, again the child's body is small, so while relative to the unit of per kilogram body weight, it may be comparable to adults, but the absolute cardiorespiratory capacity in children is significantly lower than adults, and it is prone to high degree of fatigability if exposed to excessive loads. Now let's see a video, and I leave it to your decision to figure out how appropriate.
There you go, guys. It's okay. We'll go with you in a second. You rest up. You little boy, come on. Come on.
Okay, so I leave it to your decision, how developmentally appropriate that kind of loading in and what benefit or damage it can potentially lead to. So moving on to understand the growing body a little bit more. Now we all know that there comes a time in the pubertal years when our height grows at the fastest rate. This is called as the adolescent growth spurt or the peak height velocity age. It happens slightly earlier in girls and slightly later in boys because of the gender-based difference in the age at which puberty happens. Now what happens during this time window, the bones rapidly increase in length. Whereas the muscles and tendons which are attached to the bones, they play catch up. They take a while to catch up with the increased length of the bone. And during this time, there is a inbuilt element of tightness in the muscles and tendons that leads to reduced flexibility. And because boys tend to grow much longer and taller, this phenomena is seen in boys significantly more than it's seen in girls. What is also important to understand that as the bone grows in length, it lacks the mineral density for a while. It takes a while for more calcium to come in and make the bone stronger. So you can say that for a time being, the bone is relatively osteoporotic, and this time window actually exposes the child to a higher risk of injury, both to the bones as well as to the muscles and tendons. As the muscles and tendons get stretched, it also leads to something called as the awkwardness of adolescence. It's not surprising to see a 13 or a 14-year-old boy walk with a hunch and with very peculiar stride pattern. Now this happens because the soft tissues, they stretch the bony part of the framework, and it can lead to minor changes like inward knee rotation, one leg becoming shorter than the another, the kneecap being pushed outside, the feet becoming flat. So what these minor malalignments do, they alter the line of weight transmission. So the whole biomechanics of stress absorption and distribution gets changed, and therefore the risk of injuries actually get enhanced during this time window. Now, the element of differential growth and maturity, I'm sure many of you are aware of it, but what's written that every physical education teacher, every youth coach should have a clear understanding of this phenomenon, which is perfectly natural in the course of growth and development. If you see the pictures on the right of your screen, now you see three girls at top. Now what's interesting is these three girls were born in the same calendar year. That means from the calendar point of view, or the substantiates the understanding of differential growth and maturity. That means that every child will grow at a different time and at a different rate, and chronological age and biological age may not be in sync with each other. So while we may talk about situations like under 10, under 12, under 14 age group teams, it is also important to understand while they may be of same age, they may be developmentally different, and they may not be matched in terms of strength, speed, size, skill, and other athletic abilities. Children also deal with heat in a less efficient way. While you can read there in the slide to simplify children less ability to regulate the heat from their body, and they have a higher to absorb heat from the Now, what does this mean? It means that children tend to overestimate their physical abilities and have a situation in a physical education class where the lesson is probably on striking fielding games, and it's a two-hand strike of a stationary ball. Now, as the child gets ready to strike the ball, you see another child how and where he positions himself. Okay. Some misses are fortunate, and this was fortunately a missed strike. Otherwise, it could have potentially led to an injury to the child standing just next to the striker. So this was an example to substantiate the understanding that children do not understand what is risk and hazard, and if they do, hierarchy of injury prevention. And furthermore, children also have increased tendency to engage in injury risk behaviors, an example that we just saw in this video. Children also tend to be ignorant towards protective wear and they don't really learn from previous experiences. So if they are damaged or they are injured as an outcome of risk-taking behavior, they tend to go back to it again rather than trying to figure out ways to avoid it. So these were a few peculiar characteristics of the growing body and the growing mind that all physical education and youth coaches should have a strong handle on as they teach or train the young athletes. So from understanding the growing body and the child and the mind, let's quickly move on to figure out two in physical education and youth sport. Now, I'm sure all of you are aware of what are intrinsic and extrinsic risk factors. Intrinsic risk factors, it was what lies within us, like low strength levels, low skill levels, high body weight. These are intrinsic risk factors. Extrinsic risk factors are what lies outside us, like hot weather, rough opponent, slippery surface. These are extrinsic risk factors. Like most adult athletes are regularly exposed to intrinsic and extrinsic risk factors, but what makes the young athlete different, that they are also exposed to an additional set of risk factors, which is growth related risk factors. So entire package of risk factors and their interactivity is different in young athletes, and therefore it is reasonable to suggest that the prevention strategies should also be different in this group of athletes. Quickly giving you a snapshot of the growth related risk factors. These are exactly the points that we discussed as the peculiar characteristics of the growing body and the growing mind. Because of the growth plates, the bones are weak, so that increases the vulnerability of a child to sustain bony injuries. Children don't have well developed muscle mass, so if they are exposed to high stresses of loading because of sports and physical activity, they are prone to muscle injuries and fatigue. Because of the adolescent growth spurt and the malalignments, they are at higher risk of muscle injuries as well as joint injuries. If you look at this picture of two kids running, now they are in the same level. They were born in the same calendar age. In fact, the girl towards the back is my daughter during her primary 5 days. But look at this element of differential growth and maturity. This is a total mismatch. So when this happens, the child who is at the receiving end, that means who is relatively less faster, less stronger and less capable, is at a higher risk of injury. Children cannot thermoregulate as effectively as adults can. Therefore, heat can actually make them more vulnerable to heat related illnesses. And poor perception and poor cognition and poor understanding of risks also put children at a higher risk of injury. So the whole set of risk factors, which otherwise is a part and parcel of a child's natural growing up, also subjects them to risks of injuries. In addition, children are also subject to the risk of a number of intrinsic risk factors, right? So I will not elaborate on all of these, but just a few of them which are rather more important. The first on the left of your screen is nutrition. We are all aware of the changing preferences and the changing behaviors as far as eating is concerned in the younger children. At age when their growth and development needs to be supported with a variety of micronutrients and macronutrients, we see more and more children preferring energy dense foods and sugar laden drinks, which is not really doing any good in their formative years. Also, when the body is subjected to sport, it needs to be supported by the right fuel. So not eating the right food is also going to affect their sports involvement by increasing the fatigability, reducing the element of adaptation, and so on. Lack of sleep is being increasingly reported as a growing phenomenon in young children. And sleep, shall I say more about it, is absolutely critical for all of us. It's absolutely vital for children, because it is during sleep that all the repair, rejuvenation and growth related changes happen. So if children are not sleeping enough, it constitutes as a risk factor, because the child comes back to training not recovered, not rejuvenated, not adapted completely. What's also interesting, that the literature now reports that children of current generation are becoming aggressive. They have increased risk-taking tendencies, and there is a tendency of growing disobedience amongst children that is actually leading to children not abiding by the house rules for safety in physical education lessons as well as in youth sports, thereby increasing the risk and the incidence of injury. We are also dealing with a population of young people who are increasingly sedentary. Their motor skills are not as developed as they should have been. The body weight is reflective of increasing prosperity that is also negatively affecting their fitness levels. And collectively, this also makes the child vulnerable to a higher risk of injuries as when he or she participates in sport. Children also tend to be ignorant towards the basics like warm up and cool down, use of protective wear, adequate rest. So collectively, there are a set of very logical but very common risk factors that constitute the list of intrinsic risk factors, increasing the risk of injuries in children. Looking at the extrinsic risk factor that the children are exposed to, weather remains to be a risk factor, especially given the understanding that children cannot deal with heat and humidity as effectively as adults can. Literature reports that physical activity in an outdoor environment, it led to more number of injuries than indoor environment for various reasons. The third point is especially important because I recently came across this point in a published paper. When we talk about physical education, we are essentially talking about learning and development. And when we talk about sport, we are talking about training and performance. But what seems to be a case that physical education lessons are increasingly becoming more like sport. The tasks are demanding a very high level of skill and techniques from students. And in many cases, the students cannot match up to that. Therefore, the success rates of students in the physical education lessons is getting low and low, and this affects self-perception and reduces the motivation to participate in PE or any other form of physical activity. So this is an important finding that all physical education teachers must bear in mind and make sure that the intended pedagogical outcomes are achieved by virtue of making the task collaborative and cooperative rather than competitive. While we see that the science lab in the schools is usually well maintained, we all get new equipment. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen as far as the physical education store is concerned. More often than not, we see poorly maintained and worn out equipment in the school, and many times they are not developmentally appropriate, and using such equipment poses a significant risk of injuries to the children who use it. Professional qualifications of teachers and coaches. Continuing from the message from that video, it is certainly more needs to be done in order to train the teachers and coaches to understand the growing child and to develop skills and knowledge and skills to prevent injuries in this group of athletes. What's ironical is the most vulnerable group of athletes, which is the youth athlete, they are dealt with the least experienced coaches. The coaches with the lowest level of certification are often allocated the youth group to train, which is completely wrong. Training methods. Many a times we see that youth coaches adopt adult-like training methods. So it represents a top-down approach. Now, we all know that the child is not physically or physiologically capable of handling the stresses as adults can. So subjecting the immature body to adult-like training methods, it will lead to significant overload. And not surprisingly, more than 50% of injuries that we see in youth sport are of overuse nature. With competitive sports comes greater exposure, and with higher exposure comes higher risk of injuries. Early sports specialization or premature sports specialization, if I may call it that way. Again, it's a topic we used to discuss 30 years ago. It's appalling that it's a topic we are still discussing in well into the 21st century. So it's absolutely critical for policies and practitioners to understand that premature specialization, if at all, brings about adverse outcomes to child's normal growth and development and is more damaging than beneficial in the long run. Rules for youth sport. Youth should play like young athletes. They should not try to replicate the format of adult-like games or adult-like rules, and when that happens, it constitutes a risk factor for injury in the youth athletes. So now we have discussed the growth-related intrinsic and extrinsic risk factors. Now we see how these risk factors interact with each other. What's important for us to understand that no single risk factor works in isolation. Say for example, if my strength is low and my neuromuscular skills are poor, it doesn't mean that I will have an injury. I need more to come in before an injury happens. So what this illustration shows is that the set of intrinsic risk factors need to be exposed to a set of extrinsic risk factors before the child becomes susceptible to injury, and following which a final event has to happen in form of a rough play or a tackle or a slip and fall. And when intrinsic, extrinsic and the inciting event happens, it increases the probability of injury. However, in most cases, as you see, there is no injury, and the moment there is no injury, the child gets up and gets back to exposing himself to again the intrinsic and extrinsic risk factors. If there is an injury, the child recovers and gets back to the same situation again. So what we see, that risk factors are interdependent, they are interactive, they are dynamic, but they are also cyclical in nature. So what is important for PE teachers and youth sport coaches to understand, they need to identify the population or the context specific risk factors, and to figure out the element of interactivity before developing and implementing an injury prevention program. So in simple terms, injury prevention should be a continuous process of exploration, development, implementation and refinement. All right, so after discussing the risk factors, let's quickly discuss some of the common injuries that has been reported in the literature as they happen in physical education and youth sport. Now what's interesting, that in the PE environment, the majority of injuries are acute traumatic in nature. That means they are abrupt, they happen suddenly, there is immediate signs and symptoms, and there is a clear recall of how, where and when the injury happened. Whereas in youth sport, the majority of injuries belong to overuse nature. So we will subsequently discuss, the characteristics of an overuse injury. But what's important to understand, that PE and youth sport, the majority of injuries as they happen in each of these environment is of different nature. In physical education, the most common injuries reported are ligament sprains and muscle tendon strains. Simply speaking, joint sprains and muscle overstretches. These are followed by soft tissue injuries like abrasion, contusion, bone and joint injuries, lacerations and cuts, and head injuries. The more serious injuries, although rare but has been documented in physical education, involves injury to the growth plate in the bone, complete tear of ligament, most commonly in the anterior cruciate ligament, as well as and the third injury being concussion or head injury. And why are these serious? Because they can have long-term implications on sports participation, education, health and wellness, as well as incurring a substantial healthcare costs. In terms of injury location, upper extremity is the most commonly affected body part. In terms of the specific body part, ankle is the most commonly injured specific body part, followed by the hand and wrist. The 11 to 14-year-old age group, they have the lion's share of all injuries during physical education. This is also the time when the body is moving through its peak height velocity age, or the adolescent growth spurt, and therefore it has to cope with all those challenges of overstretch of the muscle and tendon, the bones becoming weak. So not surprisingly, this particular age group has been reported to have the highest number of injuries as far as physical education is concerned. In terms of activities reported in the Western literature, running and basketball they were reported to be the most common activities. I'm sure if we do this kind of studies in different cultures, like in India, we may see different sports topping the list in terms of activities causing injuries. We have done some studies in Singapore, and what I present to you is a list of injuries reported in primary schools and secondary schools. Now, while we do have a list of injuries, what came as an absolute element of surprise is about 85% of injuries were of common type and nature, despite the children in these two levels of education being at a different level of growth and development. So this is a puzzle that we are still trying to solve, but this ideally should not be happening, because younger children should be incurring or sustaining different types and nature of injuries compared to the older children. So somebody is not doing something right somewhere, but that needs to be solved in due course of time. All right, so after discussing the injuries in physical education, let's quickly discuss common injuries in youth sport. Now, we all know that the period of childhood and adolescence is a period of dynamic change. Kids are learning new skills, they are refining what they have already learned, the bodies are growing, the functions are maturing, they are becoming stronger, faster, their endurance levels are growing, and it's a continuous change. So in this kind of a time window of continuing change, children are subjected to unique risks of injury, and the injuries are also unique, many of which we actually don't see in the adult athletes. In terms of the acute traumatic injuries, sprains and strains and fractures are at the top of the list. That means the joint injuries, overstretch of the muscles and bony injuries. Ankle, knee, elbow and shoulder are the most commonly affected body parts as far as youth sport is concerned. Coming to the more concerning injuries, which is the overuse injuries in youth sport. So more than 50% of injuries documented in youth sport belong to this category, overuse injuries. Now overuse, the name itself is self-explanatory. It is an outcome of a body part being repeatedly used. During each use, the trauma is very small, but then when it happens 1000 times, it is a very small trauma times 1000, which now becomes a substantial severity of injury. So this injury is very slow and very insidious to progress. It is mostly related to activity. So if you throw baseball, your shoulder will be subjected to this injury. If you kick the soccer ball, your adductors or the inside of the thigh will be subjected to these injuries. But what's really deceptive here, that the performance is not clear cut. Sometimes all that you see is a limp. Now limp can happen because of injury to any part of the lower limb, ankle, foot, toes, shin, knee, thigh. Injury to any of these parts can lead to a symptom or a sign called as limp. So what is challenging about these injuries, that the presentation is vague and it's very deceptive, and hence the location of the injury becomes quite difficult. As opposed to acute injury, where the child immediately communicates or presents to the coach or the PE teacher, in case of overuse injuries, it may happen very late, and in many cases it never really happens. Forget about the technical jargon of traction epiphysitis and tendinopathies. What you need to understand, and a PE teacher or a youth coach, is the most common location of overuse injuries in youth sport is the shoulder and the elbow, followed by the anterior knee. We did some studies in Singapore to see how the situation is here. So while you see in category of youth swimmers, we found that 19% of injuries in shoulder and elbow are of overuse nature. But if you look at football, look at pole vault and competitive softball, this is almost touching 70% and even more. So again, as I said, these data will differ from population to population and culture to culture. So it becomes absolutely paramount to conduct population specific studies to get a true understanding of the injury load before you start developing and implementing injury prevention programs. But what's critical, a take-home message for every PE teacher, every youth coach, is if your young athlete or young pupil complains of discomfort, ache and pain persistently, like over a week or 2 weeks in a particular area which is used predominantly in that sport, you cannot and you should not ignore this. You need to quickly take a back step and look at the training load that the child is being subjected to. You might want to consider sending the child for expert medical opinion, or just give him off for about a week for recovery to happen. But any complaints of persistent discomfort, ache or pain at specific body sites should never be ignored as far as the young athletes are concerned. So now we have reached the focus of today's topic. After we have understood the context, we have understood the characteristics of the growing body, we have discussed the risks of injuries that the children are exposed to, we have whizzed through the common injuries that they are subjected to. Let's look at some of the approaches of preventing injuries in PE and youth sport. Now, preventing injuries is absolutely critical. It needs to be understood that if we are able to minimize the risk and incidence of injuries, if we are able to make physical activity and sport safe, it can lead to multiple beneficial or positive outcomes, both in the short term as well as in the long term, including in enhanced probability to retain the talent, reduce the chance of talent loss, and better able to nurture the talent in relevant talent development pathways. So it's absolutely critical, be it physical education or youth sport, active efforts should be done to minimize the occurrence of injuries. Now the question raises, while we talk about the predictability and the preventability of injuries, are we really able to modify them? Now, before we move on to modifying to preventing injuries, we need to have a quick look at the risk factors that the children are exposed to, because it is the risk factor that eventually predisposes the child to a high risk of injury. So if you see on the top of the screen are the boxes which have the intrinsic risk factors like motor skills, fitness, ignorance, less sleep, perceptions, and so on. And the boxes below the line or the lower part of the screen have extrinsic risk factors like adult-like game format, training methods, rules, early specializations, and so on. Now, why some of the boxes have been painted as green? Because these are modifiable risk factors, and the boxes that you see in dark yellow or light orange are the ones that are non-modifiable risk factors. So what comes to us as a clear piece of understanding that significantly greater proportion of risk factors are modifiable, and that should give us the belief that we should be able to substantially bring down the risk and the incidence of injuries. And who is going to do this? Of course, the physical education teacher, and also to a large extent the youth coach. And why? Because these two groups of people, the PE teacher and the youth coach, actually have a significant amount of influence on the child's mind, habits, and behavior. So, what I would talk with you today is a four-pronged approach in terms of preventive injuries: the strategy, the model, the practice, and the research. Now, essentially, two strategies are adopted to minimize the risk of injuries or bring down or prevent injuries in youth sport and physical education: the passive strategies and the active strategies. Passive strategies are really simple. I say, as a PE teacher or coach, you just follow. Don't ask questions, you just follow. So in this case, we do not require any active participation or adaptation from the child. If the coach says put on the helmet, the child puts on the helmet. If the coach says we do stretching, the child does stretching. If the coach decides to use modified rules and modified equipment, the child simply abides by the coach's instruction. Now, not surprisingly, when this kind of strategy was adopted, which is passive, the success rates in achieving injury prevention was very, very high. The next strategy is the active strategy. Now, this requires active involvement from the child. It requires the child to participate and cooperate. Not everything will be told to you by the coach. Okay, warm up. Okay, you arrive at the pitch 20 minutes earlier. Do your own warm up. Stretching, I leave it to you. Sleep, you have to make sure that you go to bed at 10 and you obtain good 8 to 10 hours of sleep. Eating healthy, I leave it to you. Enough water, it's your choice that you make. Okay, if I tell you to follow these rules, you follow these rules. So in this case, what is required is active compliance and behavioral modification and cooperation on the child's part. But what was tragic, that despite this seemingly being a more preferable model, active strategies have often failed to achieve the right outcome in terms of preventing injuries. Now, why this happened? It happened because there was a high likelihood that the child already has in his mind, this is the way soccer should be played, and this is not the way soccer should be played. So the desired preventive behavior or the safe form of game format that the PE teacher or the coach offers is in conflict with what the child perceives as the true sports behavior. And when the child attempts to follow what has been proposed by the coach, the child's performance is negatively affected. So it is important to understand why active strategies have not been particularly successful. We also need to understand that the children come with their own set of experiences and deep-seated beliefs, all right? And they have their own set of predetermined ideas of what constitutes play or sport behavior. And when it comes to risk, we know that children do not have the capability to weigh what is risk and what is hazard. Then children also have their social agents in the form of peers, in the form of parents, and different role models. So as a child of 11-year-old, I go back and tell my dad, you know what, we played soccer today and it was a very safe game. We only passed the ball. There was no heading, there was no tackling, and that was it. Yeah, dad says, okay, cool, yeah, great, good job. On the contrary, the child goes back and tells the dad, oh dad, we had this soccer game today, you know what, I scored 2 goals. Now there comes a sense of reward from the dad, and this actually motivates the child to develop a preconceived idea of how a game should be played. So there is an element of influence, modeling, you know, that prompts the child to have predetermined ideas in terms of how behavior should be in game, and these become extremely strong determinants of play behavior and constitute real barriers for injury prevention strategies. So it is absolutely critical for a PE teacher or a youth coach to know what determines play behavior and what determines preventive and safe behavior. A PE teacher and coach should be in a state of clear understanding of the internal barriers and the external barriers that exist, that conflict the safe play and preventive behaviors. So it is absolutely critical. Each PE teacher, each coach should understand his pupils or his athletes. They should understand the context and then come up with a context specific and a strategic plan for implementing during PE lesson and sport. All right, after discussing two quick strategies, we talk about a model. Now, obviously, there are many different risk factors. There are many different approaches using which injuries can be prevented. So, it is good to put them into a structured model so that the universality of its implementation is maximized. So, the model that's most commonly used in sport injury prevention is the Haddon matrix. Now, Haddon matrix essentially, as you see, has two dimensions, a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension. The vertical dimension includes the child, the equipment, and the environment, and the horizontal dimension includes three different stages: before injury, during injury, and after injury. So, let's quickly discuss, each stage one by one. Now, what can be done in the pre-injury stage? That means the injury has not yet happened. So, all the interventions at this stage will minimize the risk and the chance of injury. So, if you look at the child row, you see words like skills, techniques, fitness and conditioning, motivation, balance and neuromuscular skills and techniques, obedience, behavior, nutrition, sleep. So all these are interventions that can be effectively used for the child and athlete in the pre-injury stage. What can you do with the environment? You can maintain the field and surfaces properly. You can upkeep the equipment. You can modify the lesson games and rules that is developmentally appropriate. You can do soft padding on the walls and pillars. We can do teacher and coach training, what we are doing right now. So all these are components of environmental interventions that can be done in the pre-injury stage. In terms of equipment, again, here comes, we need developmentally appropriate equipment which have been maintained well, modified equipment to be used for different age groups. So these are examples of interventions that can be done using this model in the pre-injury stage. Now, looking at the injury stage, now this is the situation when injury is happening. Can we do something to reduce the severity of injury? Here comes interventions like skills and techniques. I'm sure you're aware of many games, for example rugby, where athletes are taught falling skills or tackling skills, right? And this is meant to absorb the serious severity of the impact and minimize the seriousness of the injury. So developing skills, technique, strength, balance, neuromuscular coordination and control are all critical interventions to minimize the severity of injuries. If the fields are well maintained, teachers can identify the extent and seriousness of injury. This will lead to quick addressal of the situation and minimizing the potential worsening of the injury. Wearing helmets, other protective wear, they will absorb the impact and again minimize the severity of injury. So these are examples of few interventions that can be quite structurally done and high likelihood of bringing down the severity of injuries. The third part of this matrix is the post-injury phase. Now the injury has happened. You cannot turn the clock back. But what you can certainly do, you can promptly address the injury. You can stop activity so that no further loading and worsening happens. You can give quick first aid so that the injury healing and rehab starts right there. You decide on quick referral to the clinic or hospital, and you make sure that the child gets due medical care. So these are a few interventions that can be done in terms of the child or athlete in the post-injury phase. In terms of environment and equipment, you want to go back and see, was there anything risky or hazardous in the environment that may have led to this injury, and you want to quickly correct that hazard and eliminate that risk. So what comes here as a post-injury intervention also becomes a pre-injury intervention for the subsequent injury that may have happened or that may happen. So from the model, let's discuss the practices. So what I felt, I extracted every single practice from the literature and put here as three vertical boxes. Now what this information entails, these are the most successful injury intervention strategies that has worked as reported in the literature. So what you see is a ready-made recipe that you can immediately start implementing with a high probability of success. Now what you see in red font are the ones that have been particularly high in terms of its success rates, and what you see there is the coaching and training of teachers and coaches to increase their awareness, knowledge and skills for injury preventions had literally done wonders in the long run. Feedback to the athletes and students in terms of technique, skills and learning has also been reported as an extremely effective approach to minimize the risk and the incidence of injuries. Kids who generally have better control and coordination, they have found to have less risk and incidence of injuries. So exposing the kids to develop these faculties more during their early years can be very, very beneficial in order to increase the safety of physical activity participation. And lastly, what you see in the red font, during the developmental years, there should be high emphasis on learning and development and low emphasis on competitiveness. Now this is an age-old philosophy, and even the research literature is suggestive of how effective this can be if it's practiced in a proper and structured manner. Right, then we come to the last part of injury prevention, which is research. Now, as I said, while we have a lot of evidence with us from different parts of the world, it is absolutely important to understand that each culture has its own play environment. Each culture has its own population specific characteristics. Each culture has its own play ecosystem for popularity of sports. So it is absolutely critical that population specific research data is available before we develop and implement injury prevention programs. So injury prevention, it is important to understand, is not an isolated phenomena. It is a four-stage process as proposed by Willem van Mechelen in 1982, and it still holds true. The first stage of this process is to identify the seriousness of the situation. How many injuries happen? What proportion of those injuries were severe? What were the patterns? Did boys had more injury than girls? Were more injuries to the upper limb than to the lower limb? And so on and so forth. So you understand the magnitude and the profile of injuries. Second step is to understand what may have caused these injuries. Was the field not correctly maintained? Were the opponents involved in rough play? Were the equipment not developmentally appropriate? So second step works towards establishing the possible risk factors and mechanisms. Now we understand the magnitude of injury and we understand what's causing it. So the third step is to come up with a pilot program for injury prevention and institute this program in a controlled setting. And once refinements are done, and the fourth step then is to test the program in real-time settings in the real-time population, and then again repeat step 1 to find out to what extent this program has been effective. What is important for organizations to understand that preventing injuries is a collective approach. No one individual can be said to be responsible. It is a responsibility of organizations, administrators, coaches, doctors, team managers, athletes, and even parents. So what organizations can do in terms of gaining population specific evidence, they need to document injuries in their specific population. Now obviously if somebody is in youth soccer, will have a different pattern and profile of injuries compared to somebody who is in water polo. So it's absolutely critical that population specific injury documentation is done for a full year in case of physical education in school, or for a full season in case of sports. At the end of the time frame, we need to sit down, analyze this data, identify the possible risk factors, figure out which of these are modifiable, and then come up with a context-specific injury prevention program. Once this is ready, the PE and the coaching team needs to undergo training to understand the entire profile and the pattern of injuries, to understand the context in which they need to implement the injury prevention program. And once the injury prevention program is implemented, you again need to start documenting injuries at a shorter time frame, maybe every 3 months, maybe every 6 months to be on the higher side, so that we need to figure out how effective this injury prevention program are. And if we found some refinements need to be done, that is eventually included in the injury prevention program, which is again re-implemented. So as I said before, injury prevention is a continuous and a cyclical process, and we need more population-specific data to gain the maximum out of our efforts in terms of resources allocated, in terms of manpower, so that maximum impact can be gained. So to conclude, the evidence is overwhelming in terms of giving us the understanding that injury prevention in PE and youth sports can lead to multiple positive outcomes both in the short term as well as in the long term. It is absolutely critical that the stakeholders in both PE and youth sports recognize, emphasize and respect the need for an active injury prevention program. Those involved in the process, including PE teachers and coaches, should be aware of the fact that injuries are not chance occurrences. They don't happen as an accident. You know, they are an outcome of structured interaction and interdependence between various risk factors that act in an interactive manner. And therefore, injury prevention is also not going to happen automatically. It needs to be instituted. It is an active process. And in this endeavor, the training and knowledge of stakeholders, specifically in our case, the PE teachers and youth coaches, is absolutely critical. And once injury prevention programs are developed, it needs to be a sustained and a continuous process that should continue in the long run, with the belief that this is an achievable goal. It is critical to identify risk factors. Now, one needs to understand that risk factors are not stagnant. With passage of time, new risk factors will evolve, the old ones will be modified. So a handle has to be kept, and risk factors should be continuously evaluated as periodically as the injury prevention program is implemented. What also needs to be understood that if population specific data is available, if context specific injury programs can be developed and implemented, now this will maximize its effectiveness to achieve the goal of minimizing injuries, and eventually inform the best practices in physical education and youth sport, which in the long run will increase the probability of safe and continued development of child and the athlete in the long term. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah. Dr. Swarup, I think you need a break. You should have had a break. You got a comment saying that you didn't even blink your eyes. You were talking continuously. It was a wonderful session. I think it was a marathon session with a non-stop. So you have raced quite fast covering the topic. Thank you so much. But before that, we have questions, please. Yeah,
sure,
and Naren, you could take on one of the questions, and then I could ask later Kluka to speak to. Naren?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Usha Nair, madam. And it was really great session, Mukherjee sir. That was really, contain a lot of information and detailed. So, sir, I'll take this question. Sir, the first question is, an injury during football may sprain or strain or other injuries. How we know what to do if the player is very important in the match?
All right. Okay. I have not included injury management in my talk because I was given the understanding that there is a dedicated session by another doctor in this area. But I will still try and answer that question because I think that has some degree of pertinence to what I shared today. While it is critical for physical education teachers and youth coaches to develop the knowledge and skills of injury prevention, they also need to develop the skills of identifying an injury and making a decision in terms of how severe the injury is, because that will decide eventually what the coach decides about the player. Will the coach allow
Dr. Swarup, could you just stop sharing the screen and come onto the screen so we could see you?
Oh, okay. Stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, all right. Is that okay? All right, wonderful. So as I was saying that in addition to developing knowledge and skills of injury prevention, it is quite purposeful that youth coaches and physical education teachers also have some degree of knowledge and skill in terms of identifying an injury. when they see an injury happening in the environment that they operate in, they should be able to identify what that injury is, whether it's a ligament sprain or it's a muscle strain or it's a bony injury. So it is quite critical. Sorry, can you repeat your question again?
Yeah, sure. Sir, an injury during football may sprain or strain or other injuries.
Right.
How do you know what to do if the player is very important in the match?
Okay. As I said, I hope I'm sure the one of the speakers in this program will elaborately explain on the details. But there are a few very simple pointers. Okay. Now, sprain essentially means an overstretch of a ligament. That means a structure that's holding the joint is damaged to some extent. It can be a minor sprain or it can be a major sprain where the ligament is completely ruptured. Okay. Now, when this happens, a set of signs and symptoms become very obvious. The first symptom is pain because there has been a tissue damage. The second symptom is bleeding that's happening inside, leading to swelling. And then you will see a black and blue discoloration of the joint area. Now, why I'm actually trying to enumerate these three to start with, which is pain, swelling, and black and blue discoloration, because this is where most commonly the mistakes are made. If the pain is severe and the swelling is severe and it's all black, blue, and purple, it is perceived to be a very severe injury. But this is not the right approach to determine the severity of a joint injury or a ligament injury. If the ligament is injured, the factor or the sign that decides the severity of injury is how unstable the joint is, because ligaments are responsible for joint stability. So the most important deciding factor in terms of figuring out how severe the injury is should be the extent of joint instability. So if the child or the athlete stands on that leg and he can still hold his weight firmly, if he can walk on that leg, he can still hold his weight firmly, that is suggestive of a not so serious injury. But if standing on the leg is not possible, the moment you put weight on the injured leg, the ankle joint starts wobbling and the athlete is not able to hold weight. Now, this is indicative of a serious or a severe degree ligament damage. Coming about the muscle injury. Now, muscle injury is a completely different ball game altogether because muscles are big structures, right? Ligaments are very small. If you talk about ankle ligament, it is about 1 centimeter, which is like 1 centimeter in length. But muscles are huge. You talk about the hamstring muscle, which is a very commonly injured muscle in the game of soccer. It's a huge muscle. And also, muscles operate in groups. Like hamstring is a group of 3 muscles. Quadriceps is a group of 4 muscles. So what happens when there is muscle injury, the symptoms may not be that obvious. And because of support from the other neighboring group of muscles, the child or the athlete may still be able to continue. But this is not possible if the muscle tear is of a severe degree. If we go back and we recall the last race that Usain Bolt was running, he could not complete the relay because he had a hamstring injury and he had to stop right there on the track. Right now, that was an absolute severe injury. But having said that, muscle injuries tend to be very, very deceptive because despite being injured or some sort of tissue damage has happened, the athlete is still able to continue because there's a lot of support from the neighboring muscles. So it's absolutely critical to understand that about 33% of all sports injuries are muscular injuries. So they happen in plenty. But the challenge is many of them go unreported because the athlete can still continue. And secondly, because of support from neighboring muscles, most of these athletes prematurely return to sport. That means before 100% biological healing has happened, before the readiness to sport is obtained to the extent of 100%, there is a return to sport. And that is why we see that hamstring injuries tend to be recurrent, because every time with 85-90% injuries, the athlete is back into sport because athletes want to come back. They don't want to stay out sitting in the bench, doing nothing. So they are in a rush to come back and start training. So it is absolutely critical. And many of the sports situations may not have a doctor or a physiotherapist. So given this situation, it is quite important for the coach to have some degree of knowledge and skill to make some sort of informed judgment in terms of figuring out how severe the injury is, make a decision if the athlete can continue in the game or the training after that injury, and also make some decisions on the readiness of the athlete to return to sport.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Now I'll take the next question that is very relevant to the presentation. So the question is what are the basic difference you find out in the concept of physical education in India and Singapore, as you belong to our India and you are working there. So what are the basic
that sports and education are two constructs that are deeply influenced by prevailing culture and population specific characteristics. All right. And there might be limited transferability of policies and practices from one population to another. Although we try to replicate, models, they have been successful, and many a times we fail. So, what we need to understand that sometimes it may not be very appropriate or fair to compare practices in two different populations. All right. But in this case, I think there is an element of possibility, because the common thing that connects Singapore and India is, one, both are Asian countries. Two, both are in the same geographical part of this continent. Having done an honors degree in physical education from India, having served as a guest lecturer or a visiting lecturer in over 25 physical education colleges in India, and then having doing this in Singapore for more than a decade, if I have to put my finger on a few very explicit points, is I feel that the curriculum that we have here in terms of physical education, teacher education, is slightly more inclusive. Say, for example, about 40% of the PE curriculum is actually sports science. That means the PE teachers who come to us, they get to undergo full course in exercise physiology, so they understand how developmentally children are different in terms of physiological capabilities. They undergo a full course in sports psychology, so that they understand the mindsets of growing children. They undergo courses in biomechanics, so that they understand, what are the development and age-specific movements characteristics in children. They undergo courses in motor development, motor learning. They also undergo courses in sports management and facilities management, right? Of course, they undergo my course, which is injury prevention and safety in physical education and sport. In addition, they also have the 60%, which is more pedagogical, which is more physical education related, about different sports and games, instructional methods and strategies, principles of games. So I think it's a slightly more evolved curriculum, but we also work hand in hand with the Ministry of Education here, and research informs practice informs research. So this relationship is very often used in developing policies and practices. So if I have to suggest my 2 cents worth of understanding, this is something I did find when I was doing my physical education course in India. It was more about officiating and coaching, administrative processes, learning to play different sports and their principles. I don't know, this was like 20 years ago. Things I'm sure must have evolved and changed with the passage of time. But I think we and of course in our curriculum is also, it undergoes revision every 5 years, and we all do a lot of population specific studies, and we generate population specific data in terms of pedagogical areas of research, in terms of student engagement, in terms of achievement of learning outcomes, in terms of facilities utilization. So every 5 years, we generate a huge body of data, which is population specific, and then we hand it over to the ministry so that they can use this data to inform their policies and develop a refined and a revised syllabus, which is population and context specific. So I think going forward, this is sort of a best practice, and I'm not saying that Singapore developed this. We have understood the practices from Hungary, we have understood the practices from Sweden, we have the US coming to us on a frequent basis. So we have taken feedback and generated our understanding by using a global approach so as to see what works best in our population, in our context. And I think this is a common enabler every country can actually benefit from.
So thank you so much, Dr. Swarup. I think it was wonderful. A lot of questions coming in, but we
Sure.
definitely share your mail ID so that,
Yes,
because
please.
I know we'd like to continue listening to your session, but we have a time constraint. May I now
Understand that.
request Darling Kluka for your remarks, please.
I am genuinely impressed with all of the content, but even more importantly, the way in which you have presented. So congratulations. And I've been watching all over 100 comments coming in about how much they appreciated the format that you used. I have just very simple, two very simple questions for consideration. The first one is, does every school or coaching situation have a first aid kit available right there when they practice or have games?
Yeah, you want me to answer the first question? Or you want to ask both the questions?
Anyone.
Okay,
I'll
try and answer the first question. Yes, absolutely. Every single primary and secondary school, as well as junior college in Singapore, has it's like the fire extinguisher. You know, it is checked from time to time, making sure that it works. Similarly, every school has some basic elements in the first aid kit. It including an ice making machine where crushed ice is prepared, not the cubed ice, because evidence is clear that crushed ice actually leads to faster cooling down of the body parts. So most schools have this machine that produces crushed ice. In our department, we also have 2 crushed ice machines. They have wheelchairs. They have stretchers. They have splints. They have elastic wrapping supporting bands. They have protective eyeglasses and eye patches. They have sterile water. For some reason, using antiseptic is not allowed by the ministry as a policy. So if there is a wound, it's washed with sterile water, because many children are sensitive to that. They have disposable gloves. So yes, I would think the first aid inventory is quite extensive and quite well maintained in every single school. And it is a box to be ticked as a necessary requirement, and it is strictly monitored by the inspectors from the Ministry of Education more frequently than you can imagine.
Well, thank you for that. That's helpful. Just a thought for future exciting adventures like this for all of us. It sounds to me like it might be helpful to develop some type of a mini curriculum on first aid for PE teachers and coaches, and have some type of an online seminar or something, because many of the questions seem to be about, okay, the person has sprained the ankle,
Right.
Now what do I do?
Okay.
Or for prevention, how could I wrap this ankle to give more support?
Fantastic.
And I think at the community level, especially, they're very excited about doing this, but they're not quite sure what to do. So it may be for you all and all of us to think about how could we do some of these things. And I'm wondering, in your countries, do you have something like the Red Cross or the Red Crescent?
Right.
Would they be a good group to partner with to have some kind of sessions that are available for people to take so that they could get more skills?
Right. It's a very, very pertinent thought, Darlene. Just to share with you, we do have the St. John's Ambulance and other organizations that run the first aid course, including the basic cardiac life support and the advanced cardiac life support course. It is mandatory for every physical education student teacher to be certified with these courses before they start the PE program with us.
Great.
So all of them are trained and certified first aiders before the start of the program. The second part of your question, now when I teach this course in my university, there is a full dedicated session on how to identify and manage common injuries as encountered by physical education teachers and youth coaches in their places of practice. Going forward, I'm also developing a full MOOC course. It is MOOC. Yeah, so I'm actually in the process of developing a full MOOC course on injury prevention and safety in physical education and sport. And that will have a dedicated component on the skills related to identifying and managing common injuries in young children in PE and sports setting, as well as making informed decisions on return to sport once the recovery from injury is completed. So I'll be most happy to share with you when this MOOC course is ready to go online, so that people all across the world can actually register and get this course.
All benefit from
yes,
this.
absolutely.
I know Rosa's country could benefit, our country could clearly benefit, and if it's a MOOC, then many people can take it. So that would be wonderful information to share with all of us, because we can never get too smart. We can never get too smart.
Yes.
So, thank you.
Thank you, Klika. Thank you for your valuable suggestion. Dr. G. Kishore, sir?
Dr. Usha, I think one more panelist, Madam Rosa, is there. And why don't you ask him?
Rosa? Ma'am Rosa? Oh, hi.
Hello.
Hi,
yes,
welcome.
Yes.
Welcome.
I was, yes, thank you. I was reluctant to make any comment just because I couldn't arrive on time, but I just didn't want to miss the presentation, honestly, because the topic is indeed very interesting and so important for all PE teachers. And of course, I echo what Darlene said, how to make it more well known what is going on, because maybe in some PE curriculum, not maybe, I mean, I'm quite sure. I mean, this is one of the issues, this is one of the components that needs to be incorporated. So I wonder, I mean, whether in your experience, and it's just such as like a comparison, I mean, this is in Singapore, so, but what about other countries that you might be aware of that are using it? Thank you. And thank you for your presentation.
Okay, muchas gracias.
De nada.
All right. Okay.
Thank you, Rosa. But Swarup, Dr. Swarup, are you answering the question?
I'll quickly answer the question, Dr. Nair. Rosa, in Singapore, I was the one that conceived and wrote the curriculum and syllabus of this course, and we only started this course as late as 2014. But so that means many batches of physical education teachers have graduated without doing this course, right? So what I'm doing now, I'm being continuously invited by local schools to conduct a 2-day workshop on these areas to the serving physical education teachers and also school sports coaches. So that way we are actually spreading the level of knowledge and awareness across the entire country. Just to share with you, I also have invitations from other countries in the Southeast Asia to come and conduct this course for injury prevention and sports safety for their physical education teachers and youth coaches. The International Amateur Athletic Federation, which is the IAAF, also invited me to conduct the same course for youth athletic coaches. You know, so this is spreading slowly but certainly. But I'm sure once the MOOC course is available, you know, everybody sitting in any corner of the world can benefit from developing his or her skills and awareness. Comparing with other countries, if I get my numbers right, I have been to 41 countries, and most of these visits were academic visits. I'm yet to see a PE curriculum or a PE course which has a course on injury prevention. So while the need is badly felt, it doesn't seem that, you know, this element is formalized in the PE syllabus of physical education, teacher education. So hopefully, you know, this kind of monumental initiative by the LNCPE and the government of India is going to do wonders in spreading the need for developing skills, knowledge, and awareness of preventing injuries and making sports safe for children and adolescents. And hopefully it will take the coaches and the PE teachers to the next level of refinement in their operations.
Thank you. Dr. Kishore, sir?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Usha and Dr. Swarup Mukherjee. It was a wonderful session and very informative, educative, and beneficial to the entire fraternity of physical education and community coaches, and touched very important segments of injury prevention and safety in new physical education and sports. Under the gamut, you have not touched any area which has uncovered, and also good takeaway messages have been given. After giving all the way in which you have taken the session, it's very something which need to be followed, where you have gone with the background with all details, then coming to the brass task, and finally with a message to be carried away by everyone. And that is wonderful. And I would like to paraphrase some of your comments which you have made about the take-home message, that symptoms should not be ignored, and persistent discomfort should not be overlooked, and about the predictability, preventability of risk factors. So this is very important, because most of the time there is no sports person who has not been succumbed to injuries in their career. And if you trace the history of some of the sports persons who have come up to the world level, including you have talked about Usain Bolt. So all of them at one point of time has to face an injury, and then fiddle with it and try to get over. Many of them got over, some of them didn't, and many of them had a very had to be their careers had to be was affected by this, and many of them faded away, and they couldn't come to the pinnacles of their performance. So if this is one of the factors why, if we are not scientifically taking up this the injury preventive part and safety, that is what it points out. So why is it that that the top athletes are succumbing to the injury, and at that point of time, is the factor is that at their formative days, at the time, their initial days, it was overlooked, and that preventive steps are not taken. So at that point, you also pointed out that it's never a part of curriculum. It's not a part of curriculum in any of the 40 countries which you have visited, and I think that is the same with us also. So this need to have a special emphasis. That is what I think one of the key takeaway in your today's session is, that we should take it very, very seriously, and it should become a part of curriculum of sports medicine and physical education in a progressive manner from the various stages of growth. You have mentioned about the various stages of growth and the injuries associated with the various stages of growth, and also the extrinsic and intrinsic factors which leads to it. Also, we would like to what you have concluded about the old factors gets modified and new evolves, new. So even however abreast you are about the old risk factors, and again new evolves. So we have to be very alert and cautious. You told that each of this athlete need to be personally looked into, and they need to be monitored. So I think this all are excellent discourse of very important, educative, informative things which need to be learned by all. I think that is why I think the response also was quite overwhelming, and everyone was appreciating the way in which you have taken. So once again, I place on record our appreciation, and I think what you have, the presented material, whatever you have given, and that can be all the participants can have a copy of that, and that will help them to keep it refreshing their experience, and will be of much help in the day-to-day to help them in their day-to-day work. That's what I would like to tell. Thank you very much, and all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kishore sir. I'd like to thank Dr. Swarup Mukherjee because very rarely come across where a medical doctor getting into a PE course. You have understood the pulse of PE. That is why you are promoting us. So I think the entire PE community are indebted to you. We owe you so much. And for the information of the delegates, we do have a subject in the curriculum for us, but the way it is being taught matters. I think that's a very important thing, which it's a learning, it's a lesson for us, because you ask everybody who will be able to speak what it is. But from the applicability point of view is a major problem. And I'm sure with the MOOC coming in and with the collaboration, we definitely have more workshops whereby our people would have a hands-on experience rather than just
I'll be most happy to help whenever you call on me.
On behalf of the Sports Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, Government of India, Hello India, LNCPE, our Principal Dr. G. Kishore, sir, and on behalf of all the members, participants, big thanks and a salute to you because of the appreciation that we happen to see. Thank you so much, because with your smile, I think you energized and everybody got charged. So now they all are going to think of the injuries and the muscles. So you've actually, thank you.
I'll be happy to take as many questions as can be thrown at me.
Definitely, we would merit you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to thank Professor Kluka because you've been a part of us and it's been so encouraging for us. And I'm sure all the participants keep looking forward to where's Darlene. She's not to be seen today. So thank you for your valuable presence and the smiles. And thank you so much, Rosa, because I didn't see you. I was looking constantly at your mobile. I thought you hadn't turned up. Thank you so much for your valuable presence. I'd like to thank Dr. G. Kishore, sir, who's been a great support. I thank all invited guests, maybe some are not the panelists. And my dear participants, without you, this program would not have been a success. I'd like to thank my co-host, Dr. Narendra Gangwar, for comparing the session so wonderfully. I'd like to thank each one over here. And looking towards the next day.
Of course.
So, namaste.
Okay, namaste to everybody.
Namaste
Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.